tell him I said hello.
We shall. Need any water? Let me get you a glass of water.
You know, if you have water, that'd be great. That's all I need. Thanks.
Sorry, I made you wait, Stephen.
Oh, you're awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks again.
You want coffee, or would you rather have more on the set?
I don't even need it on the set. I'm just having.
You can.
I'm good. Yeah, I'm good though. Thank you.
So you want me to take it away?
Will you see it or?
You will, but I don't think anybody minds. Steve always had a drink on the set.
I think I'm good. You can take it off. I don't need it, and I have breaks if I need it.
Okay.
So I'm good. Indigenous AI, Penthegoid. Penthegoid. Stacy White is the board secretary of the International Penthegus and Penthegoid Foundation. Yes, I can. Mm-hmm. Indigenous AI, a genomics company leveraging data and artificial intelligence to speed up. Yep. Yep. That's perfect. Yeah. Work stuff on me?
No. Just me.
Alternate, perfect. Oh, that feels good.
There's a couple pieces of lint there.
So you do these about once a month?
We did 70 last year,
70? Oh my goodness.
but I don't know what the plans are going forward. There's been years they did one a month. Hello, I'm on heads. Graham, you on heads? Yeah, last year I think when they were doing live events, they did about one a month.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we start doing virtual events, they really, like we had 1 month would go by, we didn't do any, and then 1 month where we had 3 a week.
Wow.
So it was kind of feast or famine. It was really a busy schedule.
Welcome. I'm Steve Scully, contributing editor for The Hill, and thank you for joining us today in a forum on improving rare disease diagnostics and care. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Alexion Pharmaceuticals, for their support of today's event. Of the 1 in 10 Americans living with a rare disease, only a small number of them receive a timely diagnosis. And even when patients do get diagnosed with a rare disease, that is just the beginning of their journey with an often complex and ever-changing healthcare system. Today's conversation will explore the unique roadblocks that rare disease patients face in receiving accurate care, as well as the treatment that they so badly need. And we'll examine what it will take to shorten the diagnostic journey for the 30 million Americans living with these rare diseases. Now, before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag #TheHillRareDiseases. We want to hear from you. We're also broadcasting live, and we will be taking your questions throughout the course of the program. I want to welcome my first guest, Dr. Joni Rutter. She is the acting director at the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, also known as NCATS. Before joining NCATS, she served as the director of scientific programs of NIH's Precision Medicine Initiative. Dr. Rutter, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate your time. I want to begin with the most obvious question, which is how do you speed up the process of making sure that those who need the treatment get the treatment, and why does it often take so long to get those treatments in the pipeline?
This is a great question. I'm hearing some feedback a little bit here, but I think I received the question okay. Treatment, it's a great question. We refer to this as the Diagnostic Odyssey. And that refers to essentially the idea that it takes a longer time between symptom or disease onset and an accurate diagnosis. And in rare
Dr.
diseases,
I'm just going to jump in for just a moment if we could, because we're getting some feedback. It may be that you're getting a different audio source that you might want to check in order to make sure that we can hear you clearly. But again, this is a very important conversation that we're having on the issues of rare diseases. It's certainly something that all of us, directly or indirectly, have been impacted, either through loved ones or family members, perhaps a neighbor or a colleague dealing with rare diseases. And our hope today that we can really find some of the solutions for those who are dealing with the treatment. So Dr. Rutter, we'll come back to you again and ask you about the issue of improving the pipeline to make sure that the treatment is more readily available.
Absolutely, thank you. Yes, and we refer to this as the Diagnostic Odyssey, as I mentioned, and it can take about 7 to 10 years to get for rare disease patients to become diagnosed. I'm hoping that you can hear me okay. We refer to this and we try to tackle this by
so we continue to get some feedback from. Yeah. Dr. Rutter, we are getting a little bit of feedback again, and this happens in live television, but we want to fix that. We want to make sure that we're able to hear everything that you're saying. I also should point out that we will be talking to some other experts with regard to rare diseases, including Representative Diana DeGette, who is going to be joining us later, and Congressman Rodney Davis. They are both people who are on the front lines in terms of Congress dealing with these issues. And we have the audio fixed, so we will go back to Dr. Joni Rutter. Again, thanks for being patient with us. We appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. I understand that these things happen, of course. And so rare diseases are very difficult to visualize in our healthcare system, in fact. And our healthcare system is very inadequate in terms of being able to identify rare disease patients. They're essentially invisible. So it's even worse than inadequate. They're essentially invisible. And the way that we classify diseases in our healthcare system is by using what we call an International Classification of Disease Code, or ICD code. And these are assigned to a variety of different types of diseases. But for rare diseases, only a small percentage of them have a classification, an ICD code classification. And so for the most part, rare disease patients don't really exist in our healthcare system. And so we need to change. That's one thing that we need to change, is to understand how we can classify those rare diseases in our healthcare system. So this is a big impediment that we're trying to embark upon. And NCATS is supporting a variety of approaches to enable researchers to help us find ways that we can identify rare disease individuals in our healthcare system as we speak. So that's one type of tool that we're using. The other issue that we'd like to do is, of course, raise awareness that rare disease do exist. And you mentioned at the top of the hour that 1 in 10 of Americans have a rare disease. That's 30 million people in the United States and 300 million people worldwide that have a rare disease. That's a lot of people, 10% of the population. That's on the order of type 2 diabetes, for example. And the economic burden of rare disease is something that NCATS has also recently established, and that has been validated by a variety of other individuals who or groups that have also looked at this economic burden. And what we've found is that rare diseases within our healthcare system, those patients tend to see 3 to 5 times higher costs that are incurred in medical expenses. And that translates to, when you're accounting for 30 million people, to $400 billion in direct medical costs for those with a rare disease. And when you look at indirect medical costs and other costs associated with individuals dealing with rare diseases, that's upwards of $1 trillion in total costs per year that are spent on the economic burden of rare diseases. So this is clearly a huge health issue that we need to be addressing. And so identifying ways in which making rare diseases more visible in our healthcare system, by raising this type of awareness and by working with the medical community to also help identify ways in which we can use new tools and resources for making them visible in our healthcare system are certainly one way that we're trying to address this.
And Dr. Rutter, when you're talking about working across the medical communities, often there can be silos when it comes to medical research. Are they being broken down, and if so, how so?
I do believe they are being broken down. And the reason I say that is because even though there are about 7,000, maybe even upwards of 10,000 rare diseases. So there are a variety of rare diseases that have sort of siloed themselves off. But the way that NCATS is trying to approach this is that we want to look at a more than one disease at a time approach. And so we're trying to actually de-siloize that. And we can do that because when we promote some of the research activities that we do, we encourage, for example, our rare disease clinical research network to work across a variety of rare diseases and incorporate looking at how the natural history of those diseases actually manifest, to try to find the commonalities within those rare diseases. And that's one way in which we're trying to break down those silos so that we can approach rare diseases, because they're not rare, in a more than one disease at a time way. If right now it takes about 10 to 15 years for a drug to come to market. And with that, it takes about $2.6 billion to do so. So if we took a one disease at a time approach, you can imagine that would take us thousands of years before we're able to get to treatments. So the strategy of looking at more than one disease at a time is going to be critical for us to move forward. So that's why it's so important that we do break down those silos that exist. And I think that a key area for us is working within public-private partnerships, for example, to really enable those connections and those activities to advance that kind of work.
And as I said earlier, this is one of those issues that affects every American, either directly or indirectly through friends, family, colleagues. I know in my own situation with my family dealing with rare diseases. And this is personal for you as well. Why?
It is. My mother had a rare disease as well, and it took her 15 years to get diagnosed. And that time was spent, unfortunately, trying to find that diagnosis, and she was misdiagnosed a couple of times. Of course, these are tough issues. It's not a problem in terms of the medical profession, but it's really about raising this awareness. And within that 15 years, if we could have had that diagnosis sooner, there may have been other strategies, other treatments that actually could have been more effective and extended her life further. And compounded upon that fact, of course, is I'm also from Kansas, and being in a rare community, for her to receive treatments, she had to travel quite a distance to receive that treatments. And so working across these issues about rural communities, underserved communities, these are also very important in helping us break down these silos for bringing forward these approaches for rare diseases.
And certainly with pharmaceutical companies, they're in for life-saving cures, but there's also a motivation to make money. And so how do you make sure that there is the ability for these companies to do just that? Because rare diseases often affect a small number of people, and yet the treatment can be very expensive.
That's right. It's an issue that we're trying to address, again, through this more than one disease at a time approach. And one of the things that we're working on within the rare disease community is to identify ways in which we can make the market more attractive for pharmaceutical companies to embark upon looking at rare diseases. And one way to do that is to think about, again, identifying that commonality across rare diseases. We know, for example, that 80% of rare diseases are caused by a genetic mutation or a genetic problem. And if we can figure out ways to identify those genetic problems across the rare diseases, that can become sort of a platform-based approach. And using tools like gene therapy and gene editing, where you can go in and actually snip out the wrong mutation and replace it with the proper DNA code. That's an important way in which we think that therapies are going to be the wave of the future. And so we're promoting ideas and ways in which to enhance those platform approaches for that type of therapy, that gene therapy, the gene editing types of approaches, and other kinds of ways in which we can get those treatments to be platform approaches. And then companies don't have to be concerned about looking at one particular disease. They can actually use something that's very generalized and that has been proven before, and simply focus on the defect that they want to correct. And by streamlining our processes in manufacturing and toxicity and efficacy kinds of approaches for these activities, I think that will make it more attractive for those pharmaceutical companies to be interested in this sort of space. There's a program called the Bespoke Gene Therapy Consortium, which is a public-private partnership that we're embarking on with a variety of industry partners, organizations, and government agencies, including the FDA, to help exactly this. And I think that that's going to show quite a bit of promise over the next 5 to 10 years.
So based on that answer, where will we be 10 years from now in 2032? What is your goal? What's your objective? Where are we heading with all of this?
I have big hopes. I have big goals. At NCATS, we have 3 audacious goals that we are going to embark upon over the next 10 years. We want to bring more treatments to all people more quickly. And rare diseases are certainly the foundation by which we are going to be able to do this. And I think in 10 years, right now, I should say, give you a baseline. Right now, we have about 5% of diseases that have a treatment. Our goal is to bring that up to 25%, increase that by 5-fold in 10 years for treatments for rare diseases. And I think that by these types of platform approaches, by the shortening the diagnostic odyssey strategies, I think that we have a very good opportunity to get there. So we have a real opportunity to change the landscape for rare diseases. And I think all of these efforts will help us bring more treatments to all people more quickly.
But can I just underscore your final point in about a half a minute left? Only 5% right now?
That's correct. Only 5% of rare diseases has a treatment.
Dr. Rutter, she is the acting director of the National Center for Advancing Translational Scientists, part of NIH. Thank you very much for joining us today for this very important conversation. We wish you the best.
Thank you, Steve.
My next guest is Congressman Rodney Davis of Illinois. He is a member of the Rare Disease Caucus that works to bring public and congressional awareness to the unique needs of the rare disease community. And I spoke with him earlier this week. Take a listen.
Congressman Davis, Republican of Illinois, joining us from his office here in Washington, D.C. And I want to put a number on the table to begin this conversation. 7,000. That is the estimated number of rare diseases in this country. When you hear that number, when you see that number, your reaction is what?
7,000 too many. And my family is impacted by rare diseases. My wife is a 23-year colon cancer survivor. And she was diagnosed after the fact, after she had been treated and gone through surgery with a disease called Lynch syndrome, which means that we have to monitor our children because there's more of a genetic link to that rare disease. But there's so many people that I have met over my career in Congress whose families have been impacted by so many of those thousands of rare diseases. And this is personal to all of us.
So what was that like for you, for your wife, the process of finding out the cause of her condition and then the treatments available after that?
You know, Steve, I harken back to 1999. I was 29. My wife was 26 at the time. We were newly married just a few years. We had a 2-year-old daughter. And, you know, my wife just was exhausted. She couldn't go up a flight of stairs without being winded. And of course, as the sympathetic husband, I thought she might need to go to the YMCA and work out a little more, but she knew something was wrong. And she pushed her primary care doctor, pushed and pushed and pushed to get the right tests. And I'll be honest with you, that same primary care doctor, who's no longer our doctor, he told her it was in her head one time. She got the right diagnosis because she got a blood test, showed she was severely anemic, and eventually, through her own pushing, got the colonoscopy test to determine that she had colon cancer. And then it set off a treatment plan that worked great. She's doing great. But in the end, now our kids, my kids are 25, 21, and 21, and they have to be tested for colon cancer at a much younger age than what anybody else would expect.
So what did you learn about our healthcare system and about treatments available for these types of rare diseases?
Well, number one, the doctor-patient relationship is paramount. That's one of the reasons I ran for Congress. One of the reasons I have continued to advocate for fixing some of the holes in our healthcare system. My wife, if she wasn't able to fire her doctor, she would not have gotten the diagnosis that she got in time to have her colon cancer and her Lynch syndrome based colon cancer be found at stage 2 versus a more deadly stage of 3 or 4. So it's a process here in the United States where we have the ability to utilize our own doctor-patient relationship that allowed us to establish that same relationship with her surgeon and her oncologist. And what it allowed her to do is to get the best treatment possible. And she's now 23 years cancer-free.
So more than 2 decades later, obviously a lot has changed for the better, but what barriers remain in terms of patients and family members trying to really determine the causes or the conditions of these rare diseases?
Well, I think short-term, our COVID response in many states has hindered the ability of individuals who are suffering the same thing my wife did to get the diagnostic treatment that they should. I actually argued with our governor and his team when they shut down elective procedures back in the spring of 2020 to get those procedures open again, because that was about the same time frame in 1999 that my wife was finally diagnosed correctly. And if her colon cancer diagnosis was in 2020, she might not have gotten that diagnosis at stage 2. It may have waited because she was 26. She might not have had the urgency to get that colonoscopy, to get that diagnostic test as soon as someone else. So short term, we've got to change the way that we've responded to COVID, because I think we're going to have an increase in diseases that we know how to treat that are going to have a higher mortality rate. Long term, we've got to keep the doctor-patient relationship paramount. And my fear is that many of my colleagues would rather see a government-patient relationship versus a doctor-patient relationship.
And Congressman Davis, part of the equation is with rare diseases, you don't have a large pool of potential patients. So there's a debate over orphan drugs and how pharmaceutical companies can market those drugs to that relatively small pool who need it so desperately.
Well, when it comes to prescription drug access and in my opinion, the right to try any drug that could possibly help anyone that is fighting a rare disease right now, their access needs to be paramount in what policies we put in place. I was proud to support the Right to Try Act a few years ago that allows patients like my wife or others who may be in a more difficult situation in their fight to have access to those orphan drugs, have access to those pharmaceuticals and those therapeutics that might help that patient survive. We've got to do a better job of making sure that we see where the historic amount of research dollars that we have put forth over the last few years in NIH research money, we have to make sure those dollars are going to research some of these 7,000 rare diseases, because I will never settle for a lack of cures. And what we've seen over COVID is that some of the NIH dollars, we need to do a better job of oversight on where those research dollars are being invested.
I understand your own personal situation with your wife, and so glad that she's doing so well since her first diagnosis in 1999. There is often that odyssey that takes place where you're diagnosed from one specialist, you go to another, you get a different report. It can be confusing. It can make the patient and family members angry and upset. And it often takes years and years to get the correct diagnosis. Why? Why so long?
Well, a lot of times it's based upon the bureaucracy that's been set up in that local provider community. Remember, my wife was misdiagnosed in 1999, told her, our former primary care physician told her that her lack of energy was something that had to do with her mental situation. And we kept pushing. And when we got the right doctors, we got the right diagnosis. But there's also a chain of events that took place. We never would have had an oncologist if he wasn't the hematologist for her first, because they've tried things that will work, that have worked to try and address the symptoms that my wife had. But in the end, those symptoms were always going to remain until she got that final diagnosis. And frankly, when she went in for her colonoscopy, the doctors and the gastrointestinal doctor and the hematologist fully expected to find Crohn's disease, not a colon cancer tumor.
You are on a committee that focuses on rare diseases. Is this truly a bipartisan issue? Do you find the Democrats and Republicans, at least on this issue, come together?
Absolutely. And it's in the results that we've already made in a bipartisan way in investing in historic NIH research funding levels. Again, we've got to do a better job of oversight over how those dollars are being spent, because I don't think they're being dedicated toward the rare disease cures that we need as much as they should.
So let me preface the final two questions looking at drug companies and then looking at our healthcare system and the role of the federal government. First, your message to pharmaceutical companies working with researchers in trying to find cures or at least treatment for these diseases. Your message is what?
Keep it up. We're the best. We have survivors like my wife because of research that was done decades before decades before our family was impacted by her rare disease. So keep doing what you're doing and keep finding those cures. And if we can be helpful as the federal government, we're going to do that. But in the end, we can't have policies put in place in Washington that will limit our scientific breakthroughs that I know our companies and our researchers and our government can partner together to find.
And of course, those researchers not only include NIH, but also university hospitals that are part of this. So in terms of how we're structuring our research and advice you would give to the process in terms of the federal-private partnership, what would that be?
My advice to researchers would be to focus on the diseases that we know need those cures. Focus on those rare diseases that we know we can have modalities in the future based on your previous research that will be available for patient usage. Understand that we're going to go through projects that have been funded by the NIH with a fine-tooth comb as part of our oversight. So ensure that when you make that request for research dollars, make sure that there's a path to success when it comes to an outcome of curing the deadly diseases that too many families are ravaged by.
And of course, part of that has come through the COVID research and the public-private partnership when it comes to vaccines and treatment. There's also the President's Cancer Moonshot Project. Where do you think that will lead us in terms of this topic that we've been discussing today?
Well, I certainly hope it leads to more cures. I stood up and applauded a former president who announced the cancer moonshot. As a matter of fact, I had as a guest to the State of the Union that year, one of my constituents who lost a young son. His name was Johnny Wade. He had a rare form of childhood brain cancer. And his twin brother survived, and Johnny did not survive. and his twin brother was on the floor with me that night up on my shoulders. And I stood up and I watched his mom stand up in the gallery with just the biggest smile on her face, knowing that there were going to be more opportunities for families that may be going through the same thing her family went through, that they might be able to have a better outcome.
Republican Congressman Rodney Davis of Illinois joining us from his office here in Washington, D.C. Congressman, thanks for adding your perspective and your own personal experience to this important issue.
Well, thanks for having me on.
And as we continue our conversation, I'd like to introduce you to a message from our sponsor, Alexion Pharmaceuticals. We'd like to welcome Del LaBelle. He is the head of U.S. Government Affairs and Policy, and Tom DeFay, who heads up the diagnostic strategy and operations for the company. Take it away, Del and Tom.
Good afternoon. I'm Del LaBelle, head of U.S. Government Affairs and Policy at Alexion. And while patients we treat live with rare diseases, we know that this journey to treatment is long and arduous. I can unfortunately speak firsthand from dealing with a loved one as a caregiver, taking many, many years and many, many specialists to finally receive a diagnosis. And on average, it takes 4.8 years and 7.3 specialists for a patient to receive an accurate diagnosis. I'm pleased to be joined today by my colleague, Tom DeFay, who helps lead Alexion's efforts in ensuring we reach patients earlier in the diagnostic journey. And today we will discuss how to promote speedier diagnoses through methods like genetic testing and how partnerships and public policy can help move the needle forward. Tom, would you mind introducing yourself?
Thanks, Del. It's great to be joining you today. I joined Alexion 6 years ago with the goal of shortening the diagnostic odyssey for patients with rare disease. In that time, we've been working to accelerate the diagnosis of patients, including contributing to 2 world records for fastest genetic diagnoses in collaboration with the Rady Children's Institute for Genomics Medicine.
That's unbelievable when I hear world record. Before we dive into all the possibilities that exist to speeding accurate diagnoses, can you explain what makes rare diseases particularly so difficult to diagnose? When we think of common illnesses like asthma or hypercholesterolemia, rare diseases are far different. And I would like to hear your perspective on that.
Absolutely. First off, there are over 7,000 rare diseases. These diseases are by definition rare, so many of them are found once in 100,000 people or even less often. In many cases, the treating physician will never have seen a patient with that particular disorder. Making it more challenging, their symptoms can resemble those of a number of more common diseases. Practically speaking, if you're living in a region with only a few specialists, the expertise to diagnose your condition might not be readily available. However, there is good news. Our understanding of the genetics of rare disease has never been greater. And since the cost of sequencing patients continues to fall, more and more patients are getting their genome sequenced. For many diseases, including those that are not genetically driven, we're developing techniques to flag patients that may be at risk.
It's unbelievable to see where we've been, where we're going, and where we could go. It's really exciting to hear. I want to dig a little deeper into some of the methods that you just mentioned. But first, wondering if you could talk about how rare disease developers play a role in rare disease diagnosis.
So we believe that companies that develop rare disease medicines have a shared responsibility to ensure that patients can access their treatments. Now, access is inhibited when a patient can't get a diagnosis or when that diagnosis is inaccurate. As an example of what we can do, we've been working with a company called Phenomenon to apply its AI-powered genomic language processing to the published literature, in this case, millions of articles, to identify and curate the genetic variations that have been linked to diseases that Alexion has treatment for. We estimate that this work will have the potential to contribute to diagnosis with genetics about 50% more often. That's a big deal for patients looking for answers, and we've made all that information publicly available through Phenomenon's Mastermind solution. Just as a quick reminder, diagnosing a rare disease is a multifaceted effort, and our genetic understanding of disease is still growing. If a patient doesn't have a known variant, you can't rule that disease diagnosis out.
That's really interesting. Let's talk about newborn screening. Newborn screening for for rare diseases is often critical in identifying newborns' illnesses early on, even if the newborn does not yet require treatment. And in the United States, prevalence, coverage, reimbursement of newborn screening tests vary from state to state. There's a federally recommended list of conditions to screen for, but only certain states have adopted the list into their screening panels. Is consistent treatment of newborn screening important?
So as you know, newborn screening helps identify many life-threatening diseases at birth. And all babies in the US receive a newborn screening. But like you said, each state mandates different diseases to screen for. Since diseases that are found earlier can often be treated earlier, which can prevent more serious health problems, consistent treatment of newborn screening is indeed important. Building on that, we are exploring a further collaboration with Rady, potentially including other companies, to try to expand newborn screening by whole genome sequencing to every child in the US, helping to diagnose hundreds of treatable diseases. Our prior collaboration demonstrated that this approach has the sensitivity and specificity to be successful and impact thousands of lives.
It's amazing, unbelievable. Getting back to some of the methods and tools that you mentioned earlier, there are currently several bills being considered at the federal level, some of which also have state components that essentially aim to increase access to things like genetic testing and counseling. As an example, one bill, it's a long one, called the Precision Medicine Answers for Kids Today Act, would promote basic access to genomic and genetic testing. The bill, it's also included in Cures 2.0, and it would create a program at the Department of Health and Human Services for states to provide coverage of genetic and genomic testing for 3 years. And it would study how this coverage essentially improves the diagnosis of pediatric health conditions. And then another bill, ending the Diagnostic Odyssey Act of 2021, also promotes whole genomic sequencing for children by allowing state Medicaid programs to cover it for undiagnosed children up to 21. Can you speak to the importance of access to these types of testings, particularly for the younger populations?
Absolutely. Young children who are born with a rare disease face a diagnostic odyssey that typically requires years of testing and immense resources. These act as barriers to treatment and often lead to tragic results. So a state-based program focused on diagnosing diseases much earlier will certainly benefit patients. There is already clear evidence that early diagnosis and treatment of patients can improve lives. And there are hundreds of effective treatments for rare diseases that are available. And through our work helping to diagnose patients in the neonatal intensive care unit, or NICU, patients have been treated earlier than ever before. These patients avoid years of costly and painful testing, and our goal is to have as many of these patients as possible live happy and normal lives.
Well, that's good perspective. Really appreciate that, Tom. Finally, there is a piece of legislation that would increase access to genetic counselors. And currently, genetic counselors are professionals who essentially provide specialized services in medical genetics and counseling, but they don't have Medicare provider status, despite genetic counseling existing as a covered benefit. And this is an important component here, especially when you look at some of the reimbursement mechanisms. These counselors are generally licensed in the state, but the Access to Genetic Counselor Services Act of 2021 would require expanded coverage of services furnished by genetic counselors under Medicare Part B through licensing certified genetic counselors as qualified Medicare providers. Can you speak to how genetic counselors are critical for patients to access testing and ultimately a rare disease diagnosis?
Yes, this seemingly technical change would make a huge difference for patients with undiagnosed diseases. Genetic counselors help patients access appropriate testing services and identify genetic risk factors. They help patients and HCPs increase awareness of how genetics may play a role. Remember, our knowledge of genetics has leapt forward in recent years, and genetic counselors are critical for interpreting and evaluating the evidence that we can now generate, which helps to achieve the diagnosis. But this is an important part. Access is more than just access to the diagnosis. It's also about access to the knowledge that helps patients make informed decisions about their care. Genetic counselors play an essential role in empowering patients by making genetic results more understandable and helping them decide what to do for their own individual situation.
So important. Thanks, Tom. Really appreciate your perspective. And on behalf of Alexion, I would like to thank you for letting us share our perspective with you today on really such an important topic. And it is our hope that this dialogue continues, that this dialogue will essentially inform policy recommendations to increase earlier and accurate diagnoses for the 30 million Americans living with rare disease. And as an Alexion U.S. government affairs and policy organization and organization more generally, we really aim to work with rare disease, the rare disease community at Broad to further refine public policy recommendations around diagnostic policies this year and beyond. Thank you.
And again, our thanks to Del LaBelle and Tom DeFay, both with Alexion Pharmaceuticals, our sponsor for today's program. And our first panel of the day, really taking a much deeper dive into the technology and the innovations that can make a difference in the lives of rare disease patients. We're pleased to welcome Dr. Bradford Wilson. He's the co-founder and chief scientific officer of Indigenous AI. It's a genomics company leveraging data and artificial intelligence to speed up the drug development process while also addressing health disparities, especially among the minority community. And Dr. Ann Pariser is the Vice President and Medical and Regulatory Affairs at Alterna. It's a biotech startup working to develop tRNA as a therapy that could be used in thousands of genetic diseases. Prior to this, Dr. Pariser was the director of the Office of Rare Diseases Research at the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences. And so to both of you, thank you. Dr. Wilson, I want to begin with you in particular with the population that you were doing the most research among African Americans. But I want you to explain, if you could, what is genome sequencing and what do you hope to learn?
Absolutely. First and foremost, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation to be a part of this discussion. What genome sequencing is essentially taking your genetic material or your DNA and determining the precise sequence of the letters in the genetic code of your complete genetic code. And that to this date has been quite expensive, but recently the cost has been reduced drastically, which then creates the opportunity for large-scale sequencing and whole genome sequencing, meaning sequencing of the entire genome, all 3 billion letters of your genetic code. And this is essentially, this is unique to everyone, and it provides an unprecedented level of information about that individual on a molecular level, as the genome provides the instructions to code for all of your body's proteins, essentially. And it serves as your body's blueprint for construction of its proteins. And what we now know, as over the past 20 years, as we've completed the draft of the genome about 20 years ago, is that we have the ability to identify specific variants that correlate directly with given disease phenotypes. And in the rare disease population, or when we're looking at rare diseases, this is a very, very powerful tool that can be leveraged to quickly identify the causal factors in terms of genetics, and also identify biomarkers that can then lead to early diagnosis and ultimately for improved outcomes.
So let me follow up on that point. Clearly, if you are the patient, you want to find out the causes and potential cures. If it's a loved one that is suffering from a rare disease, what will this tell that individual? For relatives of individuals with rare diseases,
actually the family unit, a family cohort is a very powerful, is an even more powerful tool, as you have individuals who are genetically related, share genetic sequences and share a DNA sequence, a certain percentage depending upon the level of relationship. But then you have individuals within that family, some of which are affected and some of which are not. So within that family, you can compare members of that family and then quickly identify the genetic variants or the genetic drivers of that rare disease.
And Dr. Pariser, you are on the front lines of trying to find treatments and cures for these individuals. We've been talking about the problem. Where are you optimistic? What are the silver linings in all of this as we move forward?
Oh, I think there's a lot to be very optimistic about right now. We've had tremendous advances in our ability to analyze the genome sequencing for individuals and as well as the groups, and also for disease specifically to find whatever that molecular underpinning is. And once you find that underpinning, well, that now gives you a target that you can go after. And this is really where the vast majority of drug development is now, is these precision approaches where you know what that underpinning is, and now you can design drug therapies around that. So, for example, we're seeing a big increase in genomic therapies, where, for example, you're lacking a gene and now you have the ability to give it back. Or what's coming on the horizon is editing. So what is that specific mutation? Can we go in and just change that specific mutation? Or can we alter the reading, the mRNA or the reading frame, and how it translates into a protein? So these are all things that are just undergoing a lot of development right now, and a lot of these have the potential to just be incredibly effective.
But as you know, so often it's not just a single rare disease. Often it's rare diseases that a person is suffering from. So how do you combat that with treatment? Because it seems to me, from a layman's term, it can get pretty complex.
So for the most part, when you're looking at some of these very serious rare diseases, a lot of them are what we call single gene disorders, where it could just be the change in just one amino acid in one gene that can cause a whole host of problems. So I think we have to keep in mind that the diagnosis has improved drastically in recent years. So most people we're seeing now do tend to have one disease. That's not to say there aren't a few people that don't have more than one, but that's where a lot of the illness that we're seeing is. And that now we have the ability to focus very hard in on those individual disorders.
I want to spend a moment to focus on the organizations that you both represent. And Dr. Wilson, you're the co-founder of Indigenous AI. So explain, first of all, the name and your mission.
Yes, the Indigenous, it's pronounced Indigenous, but there's a focus on genetics, and hence the unique spelling. And our work in our company is focused on, genetic, health disparities that disproportionately impact traditionally underserved and underrepresented populations. And this is our mission, because we know that essentially the field in terms of genetics is very, very skewed in terms of the data that's been generated, and where less than 3% of all the genetic data from large-scale studies like genome-wide association studies or GWAS studies represents populations from the African diaspora. And the significance of this is that those populations just so happen to be the most genetically diverse. And if they are not represented in genetic studies, often is the case is that there are population-specific variants, population-specific mutations that are driving diseases in these populations, and that can potentially account for some of the disparities that we see in many of these areas.
And Dr. Pariser, the work that you do at Alterna, and I'm curious the cost and benefit of the research, the treatment, and the number of people you're able to offer those services to, while also be able to continue the research, which costs a lot of money.
It does, but I think we also need to keep in mind that these are overwhelmingly serious diseases, and serious diseases, it costs money to take care of people who are ill. But if we can focus on trying to make a difference in that disease trajectory, then we're really working towards trying to put those costs towards improving people's lives, rather than merely managing the relentless progression of these disorders. So, I mean, I think that's true of all diseases, rare and common. If we can manage these diseases, attenuate them, even cure some of them, then, it's money well spent towards improving people's lives.
And we talked about this with Congressman Davis, but from your perspective, Dr. Pariser, how do you speed up the process, and where are the roadblocks when it comes to some of the treatment?
I think some of them people have already mentioned. We certainly need much better access to whole genome sequencing. And it's not just that people get access to it, but we need timely access to it. A lot of these diseases are chronic and relentlessly progressive, and we want to get to people before they have irreversible complications. So we should be getting these sequences early while we have a real chance to intervene. And some of the efforts Dr. Wilson is doing, using machine learning, using medical records, developing algorithms to try to find people who are undiagnosed in systems using information that we already have. These are some really promising techniques. And, nobody can walk around with 10,000 different diseases in their head. We need the machines to really help us. And then also, you can't diagnose people unless you think of these. And rare diseases, I think, as you very well said, rare diseases are not rare. Collectively, they're not rare. And frontline physicians are going to be seeing these. And we need to really raise the awareness, if not for a specific disease, but that a rare disease is a possibility, and try to escalate those people much faster with appropriate testing.
And Dr. Wilson, you talked about the minority population, which is often underserved, and clearly inclusion is a key part of the work that you're trying to do. But there are so many other factors that come into play, economic and social factors, in trying to make sure that you are reaching the patients, and more importantly, that the patients are reaching you.
Absolutely. There, unfortunately, there is a trust issue with members of these populations. And as a result of, some historic, unfortunate events and some historic exploitation, for example, the case of Henrietta Lacks. And as a result, there is a need for an increased level of transparency in order to establish that trust of these populations for them to participate. And but the significant point is that their participation is critical and it's essential, right? And it's not only critical for identifying drivers of health disparities, but also identifying signatures and patterns of variation that are associated with health. And that stands to not only benefit these populations, but all populations.
And Dr. Pariser, I'm curious, is there a sense of urgency among researchers as we move forward on all of these fronts?
Yes, there absolutely is. I really think in the past, 5 to 10 years, it's a very different environment now with the better understanding of genetics and our ability to really go after these diseases in meaningful ways. And every day, really, we have more examples of successes and advances that our ability to make a difference now it's here. It's here for a lot of these diseases. So how do How do we make it move faster? How do we learn from one disease and one program to another? How do we not reinvent the wheel every time? And what are things that can be shared that is really, it's going to raise all boats?
Dr. Wilson, I want to give you the final word based on what you've been hearing from Dr. Pariser. Where are we on these fronts?
With regards to access, the costs, although they are falling, access to the level of genetic testing that is ultimately going to be required, which is in the form of whole genome sequencing, is still not very prevalent. They're still not very accessible. In some cases, there are some organizations that are leading initiatives in certain specific disease areas that are offering services to populations and communities that wouldn't ordinarily have access to that level of genetic testing. But overall, the access is very poor. And when we look at the global population, there's only been a very small percentage of the population that's been sequenced, and there's essentially the power to solve human disease in general, and not only rare disease, through this technology. And so with regards to its availability, there needs to be great improvement in the availability of this testing, as well as the genetic counselors, which is also very, very critical to this whole equation, as they play a critical role in not only the interpretation of the results, but with regards to the ethics behind this testing, and for patients to have a clear understanding of what the test is telling them and what the results mean, and how that impacts them psychologically with regards to their disease condition.
To both of you, thank you, and continued good luck to the work that you are doing. Dr. Bradford Wilson, he is the co-founder and chief scientific officer for Indigenous AI, and Dr. Ann Pariser. She serves as vice president of medical and regulatory affairs at Alterna. Thank you both for joining me today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
And now for a very personal perspective on all of this, joining me is Stacy White. She serves as the board secretary of an organization called the International Pemphigus and Pemphigoid Foundation. Stacy was diagnosed with pemphigus vulgaris, also known as PV, back in 2011. About a decade ago, it's a rare chronic autoimmune disorder that causes antibodies to attack the skin. After what was a long journey battling PV, Stacy will now celebrate 6 years in remission this summer, and so for that, we congratulate you, Stacy. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me and for having this event.
So let me begin with your story. Walk us through the journey that you undertook before your disease was diagnosed.
So in 2010, the fall of 2010, I started experiencing symptoms. So I went to my gynecologist actually because I thought I was experiencing lesions in my vaginal area. And she tested me twice for an STD, only to discover that the test came back negative twice. And even though that was the case, I was still given a script for a cream, and the lesions eventually went away. I spent the next several months just dealing with a variety of different issues that seemed unrelated on the surface. A sinus infection that wouldn't go away, losing my voice, things like that. And by the spring of 2011, I started experiencing lesions in different parts of my body. And I went through a battery of blood and urine tests, went to multiple dermatologists, went to my primary care physician, all of those, any provider I could find. Meanwhile, the disease was essentially exploding in my body. Finally, I was diagnosed with shingles and given treatment for that. And during that time of my treatment, I went from having a few lesions to lesions covering about 85% of my body. In the midst of that, the dermatologist that had diagnosed me with shingles then called me, actually had his nurse call me and tell me that they made a mistake and that I probably had something else. They just weren't sure what it was, but it was probably an autoimmune disorder. And they then referred me to NYU on Memorial Day weekend, on the Friday of Memorial Day weekend to be specific, and said that I needed to get in touch with someone there who could help me figure it out. From there, I spent several days in a pretty deep depression, a couple of days trying to figure out if I could play doctor myself on the internet. And then finally landed in the ER of Hackensack University Medical Center in New Jersey with, as I said, lesions over about 85% of my body, unable to stand erect, and was finally diagnosed while I was in the emergency room.
Had you ever heard of this condition? Was there any connection to any family members that might have suffered from a similar disease?
No, I had no idea what it was. I could barely pronounce it, to be quite honest. And when I landed in the ER, I was struck by the fact that the attending at the time, who I will forever be grateful for, said that she thought she had seen it in a textbook in medical school. And that then triggered a course of events or a chain reaction in terms of actually getting me a diagnosis.
So where does pemphigus come from? Where does the term come from? What's its etymology?
So essentially it is my immune system just not acting the way it's supposed to in the simplest terms. And it affects the dermis layer of the skin. And essentially it is your skin attacking itself. So it's as if when people think of getting a scab, that's the body's natural way of protecting itself. And my body was essentially attacking my healthy tissue as if it was unhealthy. And I was just having repeat scabbing blisters that would just pop, and then the process would just start over and over and over again.
So for those who have suffered shingles, this sounds like it's, for lack of a better term, shingles on steroids. It sounds awfully painful. It's extremely painful, and certainly my case was one of the extremes of it. Shingles tends to be in certain areas of the body in specific places. This was, as I had mentioned, over most of my body. So wherever you could imagine it could be, I had lesions in my hands, on my feet, on my legs, in my head. It was pretty much everywhere where there was skin, there was some type of lesion on my body. And we should point out that you have been involved in your adult career over the last 20, 25 years with educational healthcare nonprofits. So you are familiar with the healthcare industry. But just on a personal level, so whether you want to take a walk, take a shower, just the normal day-to-day activities with this condition, how did you deal with it?
It was challenging. It was challenging because it was, like you said, just doing the basic things that a human being wants to do in an independent adult. I was 38 when I was diagnosed. And I lived on my own and was ferociously independent. Mm-hmm. I couldn't open a bottle with my own hand. I had friends who would come over just to open a Gatorade bottle. I had to accept the fact that I needed people to help me take care of myself. I received a similar level of care as a burn victim. So I had to have nursing support in the initial stages of it. I had friends and family members who did rotations. My body was wrapped in gauze in different areas to keep me safe. So it was humbling in that experience, but as someone who works in healthcare, particularly in the moment that we've been in for the past 2 years, the level of empathy and connection I have with patients and that I'm able to communicate to my teams as important was invaluable from that experience.
But Stacey White, your story is also an inspiration, and as we said at the top of our introduction, you are now in remission in 6 years. What was the treatment?
So I was on a medication cocktail of prednisone, of Celsep or mycophenolate, and a variety of different drugs to offset the side effects. So prednisone is, many people are familiar with, it's a steroid medication. And CellCept is typically used for patients who have had an organ transplant. It's an anti-rejection drug at the end of the day. Both of them suppress the immune system. So in many ways, it was my physicians were kind of tricking my immune system to acting the way that it needed to.
And having gone through this now, and I hate to ask the question, but how do you make sure it doesn't come back again? What are your biggest concerns?
You know, what I've recognized in the process is that there's nothing I can do short of moments like this with you and the Hill and the advocacy work that I do with the International Pemphigus and Pemphigoid Foundation toward working toward a cure and awareness. That's what I can do in that space. In terms of making sure it doesn't come back again, I don't have control over that other than advocating for a cure. So I think it's one of the messages I want to make sure people understand, particularly those in the position of making decisions about policy, about rare diseases or for rare diseases. When you are in remission and not cured, it is always a part of your being. So you're acutely aware of the possibility of it coming back. So it never really leaves your spirit. So that does weigh on you, but I choose to approach it from a perspective of wellness. So my general attitude is that I believe if I'm in the healthiest state I can be in, I'm in the best position to fight this thing. And so far, so good. But I also recognize it could come back, but I don't live my life waiting for it to come back. I live my life trying to take the lessons that it gave me. And it gave me numerous unexpected and beautiful gifts that I would not have asked for, but that I am deeply, deeply grateful for.
Two final points. We've used the term diagnostic odyssey for those who need to figure out what's causing this illness. And you indicated that you were getting different diagnoses from different doctors. So what did you learn about the medical profession as you went from physician to physician to say, hey, what's wrong with me?
What I learned is that there is a need for a multidisciplinary approach to diseases, period. I liked very much what the doctor who was right before me said, in that, consider rare disease as an option. Don't just assume it's what you have already known. I've learned that physicians and medical providers need to maintain that same curiosity that made them an interest and excitement that made them get into the medical field in the first place. And if you see something you don't know, ask some more questions and listen. Please, if you do not hear me say anything else, please listen to patients. We know when something is wrong. And even if we don't have the words, trust that we know that something isn't right with us. And ask the question and ask your colleagues, dig a little deeper and do it with compassion.
Your body is telling you something, which is really my final question, very simple one. How are you doing today?
I am great today. I am grateful. I often tell people I often talk about the gift that Pemphigus vulgaris gave me, and it sounds terribly counterintuitive, but I learned a lot about who I am as a person during a really difficult time. I also became the person I was supposed to be. I think that I needed to sit down. For those who know me, that was not my MO. That's not who I was. I was always busy. I was always moving. I didn't appreciate the fact that speed and movement forward requires relaxation. And I also birthed a great deal of creativity. So I am doing extraordinarily well. I'm grateful that my journey has put me in a position where I can now be a voice for the 30 million, or one of the voices for the 30 million of us living with rare disease.
The brightest rainbow after the darkest storm. Stacy, thank you very much for sharing your story with us. We wish you the very, very best.
Thank you so much.
Our next panel is going to look at some of the solutions for patients and what is still needed on the advocacy and equity front for rare disease. Molly Murray is the president and CEO of the Autoimmune Association. It's a nonprofit working to improve the lives of millions of people affected by autoimmune diseases. We also want to welcome Dr. Marshall Summer, the director of the Rare Disease Institute at the Children's National Hospital. And Julia Choi is the president and CEO of the Health Justice Organization, the Asian American Pacific Islander American Health Forum. She's also a steering member of the Rare Disease Diversity Coalition. Welcome to all of you. And I want to begin with Julia Choi. We've been asking for questions from our audience, and this is one from Michael Causey, a tweet. with this question for you, Ms. Choi. How important is it to improve clinical trial diversity to address rare diseases and other treatment areas?
Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here. And thanks, Steve. What a terrific question. The short answer is yes. Investments in clinical trials is absolutely critical, especially in the context of rare diseases. And I want to underscore and state that we absolutely need to double down, triple down in our investments when we think about clinical trials, but also from a lens of inclusion and communities of color. Just briefly, I would highlight, for example, the National Institutes of Health. Since 1992, out of its incredible budget and priorities for investments in clinical trials, has invested less than 0.2% in clinical trials for the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities. Not 2%, but less than 0.2%. So when it comes to investments, I think this is something we need to look at collectively, advocate for together for rare diseases and also for communities of color.
And Molly Murray, we've been hearing from patients who have been dealing with this. They really do need to navigate through this treatment process, but they first need to figure out what the problem is, what the diagnosis is. Can you address that issue as the CEO of the Autoimmune Association?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, again, thank you for having me be here today as well. But I think you hit on a really important, question, how to navigate the system and get a diagnosis. And I think a major part of that is just awareness about autoimmune disease. We know that less than 6% of Americans can name an autoimmune disease. And so, our job as a patient advocacy organization is to help the community understand, the general public understand what autoimmune diseases is, to ask the right questions and empower themselves to seek a diagnosis and to stay strong and continue to get the answers that they need. And I think that, Representative Davis talked pretty eloquently about that in terms of life and sort of being, an advocate for herself in the system. But it certainly is, part of this is awareness and educating the public that these diseases exist and to keep pushing for answers.
Dr. Summer, from your perspective at Children's National Hospital, you're on the front lines in terms of the research. Can you walk us through the numbers of what we're seeing among children and rare diseases?
Sure. First off, great to be here today. Thank you so much, and to my other panelists here. The numbers are getting interesting. So first thing, since we finished up the Human Genome Project, we are averaging somewhere between 10 to 12 new disease descriptions per week in the rare disease field. So it's an absolutely unprecedented growth compared to any other field of medicine. When we look at the numbers we'll just take a children's hospital as an example. If you get admitted to a children's hospital, there's about a 20% chance that you already have or will shortly have a diagnosis of a rare disease. The numbers for the national population are probably somewhere between 6 and 9%. But in the pediatric population, kids are basically healthy. So if you're coming into a children's hospital, rare disease is a big issue there. Interestingly, we looked at patients who'd come more than once to a children's hospital. 30% of those patients already or had soon carried a diagnosis of a rare disease. So it's a huge impact. The other thing we've looked at is how much what are the resources for these patients? They actually see more specialists than any of our other patient populations. If we look just at referral patterns and everything else, these patients end up, oh goodness gracious, they end up seeing so many people. The organization, the navigation for these families is often quite difficult. And about 30% of the patients we see in our clinic here at Children's National are actually adults. And adults have the same issue. In fact, in many ways, adults have even fewer resources for rare disease than children do, because it's just not something we're used to.
Dr. Summer, you wrote a piece for thehill.com, and I love the analogy, so I want to get your reaction. And right. Molly Murray, I want to get your thoughts as well. But you said, quote, genetics is often cited as the future of medicine. We just need to fix the potholes in the road to get there. So where are the potholes?
Yeah. The potholes there's a couple. One is awareness. So there's a classic model where a physician in a field is expected to know everything about every condition in his field. And while that's true for some specialties to this day, in the field of rare disease, it's just no longer possible. We are dependent and have to work with our patients and families. We have to work with high-end informatics tools and bringing those along. The medical system's not really designed. We work in a medical system that's designed around procedures. It's designed around testing, things like that. But the idea of having it designed around the needs of over, I think currently about 8,000 different conditions, it's not that great. And our payment systems really have got a lot of catching up. I know a lot of our families get very frustrated because they'll work with their payer and the payer will have never heard of the condition they have. It may not have even existed a year ago. So lots of potholes, but you know what? There's a lot of folks with shovels and gravel too.
So Molly Murray, I want to get your reaction to that, because in the work that you're doing, different patients have different conditions and it varies. And so this makes it far more complex when it comes to treatment and cures. Molly Murray, did you want to respond to that?
You broke up just a little bit there. Can you repeat your last remarks?
I want to follow up on what Dr. Summer was saying, is that there are potholes in terms of the treatment. And from the work that you're doing, there's such a disparity between one patient and another in terms of what condition he or she has and the potential diagnosis and treatment for that individual.
Yes, and I think, from a patient advocacy perspective, certainly, I touched on this, how important awareness is, but I think there certainly are potholes, right? And one of those potholes, I think, is just, patient engagement in, patient registries and the clinical trials that Julia touched upon, right? And so I think unless we can get patients, into these settings to collect the data, to be able to have better diagnostic tools and ways to address these sorts of issues, it's going to continue to be a challenge, right? To have this understanding around these diseases, and certainly, the potholes that exist in terms of access to care, like we know, outpatient costs are rising, right? And it's incredibly difficult, for a lot of patients to afford the treatments that they need. And so, again, from a patient advocacy perspective, what can we do to bring awareness around some of these challenges, to make sure that patients are getting the care that they need, that legislators understand the challenges that patients are facing, to be able to navigate and get the care that they need. And certainly, Dr. Sumar, touched on this, right, just sort of understanding and in the physician community. When I talk about bringing awareness not only to patients, but also to physician communities as well, and provider communities to understand kind of what, to look for that rare disease diagnosis and not overlook it, is really important. And so I think, again, as a nonprofit organization trying to make awareness and education around these issues, I think bringing all those stakeholders to the table, can only help patients get the care that they need.
Julia Troy, we talked earlier with Dr. Wilson about the disparities among the African American population. From your perspective with Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, why is there such a disparity? Why not equality when it comes to the type of diagnosis and treatment that should be available to all individuals?
Sure. And I think you may hear some background noise. I've got some engines, fire trucks in the background here. I want to ask us to take a step back here. Providing some context from the rare disease perspective. One set of numbers that are floating around include, it takes an average of about 5 years of consultations and perhaps a set of 7 clinicians to receive a proper diagnosis when it comes to rare disease. And then where I ask us to take a step back in terms of disparities, whether it's the Black community, Latino, or the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities, it really comes down to, are we making progress in addressing the institutionalized barriers to care? And also, are we empowering and prioritizing community inclusion? For the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities, I think some of the top challenges in terms of access, and I don't think it's unique to our set of communities, but it really comes down to trust and your access to your set of doctors who can walk with you through your journey, especially as you've received a diagnosis with regard to a rare disease. And then even more fundamentally, on the trust factor, is the information that you need, is a discussion that you need to have, can it be conducted in a way that's linguistically accessible? English happens to be my first language, but if English is not your first language, does that mean somehow you're less deserving of being able to have that really informed dialogue with your treatment team? And then when it comes to culturally competent care, I always want to advocate, we need to grow the pipeline. We need to advocate for a diverse pipeline leadership effort so that we see more doctors, more healthcare providers that look like us, that can bring those community inclusive ideas to the table.
And doctor, with regard to the work that you're doing at Children's National Hospital, getting the diagnosis is the first challenge. Right. Dealing with the treatment, which is often another odyssey, is yet another one. Why?
Well, you pointed it out just beautifully here. So first, we do have to get a diagnosis. That has its own challenges. Currently, for approved therapies for the 7,000 to 8,000 different conditions, we have about 600 FDA-approved therapies. So one thing we found is often we don't have a ready or at-hand therapy for some of the disorders we do diagnose. For some, we're desperately needing them. Some of them, we've got to develop some new technology, things like that. But also just the day-to-day care, whether it's a therapy that is needed, speech language therapy, physical therapy, school special classes, or special help in school, depending. We've got so many. It's such a wide spectrum of these things that we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how we're going to get that patient the absolute best care we can, given what we have right now. And with so many different scenarios, it gets to be a complex task. But you know what? That's where the partnership with our parents and families comes in. I must say that there's very rarely a week goes by that I'm not amazed by the resources and resourcefulness of the families we work with. It's absolutely amazing. And it's kind of what keeps us going from our side.
But Molly Murray, where are the biggest challenges? What is the goal that you have and the challenges for you to get there?
Yeah, I think, for us, again, as a patient advocacy organization, I do think that it's, getting patients, I think that we have a responsibility, and I think Juliet, touched on this as well, to kind of serve as a resource to the patient community, and serve as a trusted resource when it comes to engaging in clinical trials, when it comes to engaging in patient registries. There's definitely a trust issue there, I think, sometime, and an understanding of what this means and what's going to take to engage in this space. Certainly, I think that Dr. Wilson, touched on this, sort of the lack of diversity in clinical trials and in patient registries, and how important it is to have those populations represented when you're looking for the types of data that you need to reach the solutions that are needed in terms of diagnostics and therapeutics. And so we're really trying to bridge that gap as an organization to build trust within the communities, certainly, and minoritized communities as well. And I think from there, we're going to have more answers, more therapies, that can be, just beneficial across the board. And so I think for us, we just want to serve in that role, right? To bring understanding, to bring education to the community so that we can derive some solutions by the patient participating in the process and the patient getting engaged and feeling comfortable with engaging in the healthcare system and the clinical trials and patient registries that are out there. And I think they can only lead to good solutions.
But Molly, Maria, follow up to you on that. And Julia, Troy, I'd like to get your perspective as well. Is Congress helping or hindering in this process? What's your message to them?
Molly, you go first here. This was great. This is a wonderful question.
Yeah, I think, so at the Autoimmune Association, we have 4 pillars, right? One of them, education, awareness, research, and advocacy, right? And so I think that, when you look at, rising costs, right, inflation, that we're facing as a nation just generally, right? And you look at how difficult it is to kind of have access to healthcare and getting coverage and rising out of pocket costs. I think there certainly is action that Congress can take, right, to address some of these issues. And I think that it's only getting more complex and more difficult to navigate. And certainly that is if somebody, for somebody who has insurance and understands the healthcare system, it's difficult to navigate. So you look at populations who don't have an insurance, who don't understand the healthcare system, and what that means in terms of getting access to care, what that means for delayed care, and how disease can progress when there isn't a timely treatment. I think that there's certainly a lot that Congress can do to break down some of those barriers and help patients navigate the system and get the care and coverage that they need. So a lot of work to be done in that space, and something that we're thinking about and working on. And
Julia,
then
Troy, your quick
funding
follow-up
for research. I think there's a lot of. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm a DC resident. I'm still an optimist at heart here. And so I think Congress has made some investments, and I think the challenge is bringing about bipartisan support so proposed bills actually become realized legislation and laws of the land. Just to share a couple of examples without getting too wonky here, there is this longstanding bill called the Health Equity and Accountability Act. It's been introduced and reintroduced. I think one of the key elements in that bill does underscore and highlight the absolute need for disaggregated data. And we've talked about rare diseases, how it can impact different communities of color. And without disaggregated data, we're never going to know what we don't know. So we need to understand what our communities look like, how they're impacted. So the Health Equity Accountability Act is one that my organization and our partners in the health equity space, we continue to champion, particularly the disaggregated data lens. A couple of other efforts, I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that in the next, few years, again, with our panelists' voices and everybody else that's joining us, this conversation about rare diseases is so critical. There has been something called the Diverse Trials Act. And at its core, it does address tackling financial and technology barriers, right? So these are, common sense barriers, but actually need some required legislation to lower the threshold to make sure that our families can access the care where care is available. Last but not least, there's so many other opportunities here as well. The good doctor highlighted how many rare diseases continue to be discovered. We need Congress and the executive branch to be able to work in partnership so that we can accelerate approvals for treatments when it comes to rare diseases. One of the statistics I understand is of all rare diseases, only 5% of those rare diseases have FDA approved therapies and treatment plans. And so that, I think, low-hanging fruit together with Congress and the executive branch, we absolutely want, demand, and expect enhancements to take place over the next handful of months and years going forward.
And I want to thank all three of you for a fascinating conversation. Doctor, I want to let you have the final word with only about a half a minute left, but if you could put a capstone to this conversation, because you wrote, it is no longer a luxury to deal with rare diseases.
Right. So the treatments for rare disease are expected to top 22 to 24% of world drug expenditures in the next 4 or 5 years. This is a field that is going to become more and more mainstream. In fact, it's emerging as a field of medicine if we don't put some proper things in place, because it is different from a lot of our other fields of medicine, because these groups of individual rare diseases are so small. We've got to think about some new and creative ways to do things, because it is very different. So I think we got a lot of good people. We got a lot of smart folks. There are two of my fellow panelists here, are two of them. I think I'm optimistic, and I will remain optimistic. And I'm also a DC resident, and as Juliet knows, that sometimes it's hard to maintain that, but we can.
Three very important voices representing the Autoimmune Association. We thank you for that. The director of the Rare Disease Institute at Children's National Hospital and the CEO of the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum. We thank all of you for joining us here today. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
My final guest is Congresswoman Diana DeGette of Colorado. She is the chair of the Energy and Commerce Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee. She also is the co-author, for the purposes of this conversation, the 21st Century Cures Act. She recently introduced Cures 2.0 Act, along with her colleague, Republican Congressman Fred Upton of Michigan, as a follow-up measure to speed up the delivery of cures and treatments for rare diseases. I spoke with Representative DeGette a short while ago. Joining us from her congressional district in Colorado, Representative DeGette, thank you for joining us. I want to begin big picture, because you have been immersed in the issue of rare diseases in this country and globally. So just how big of a problem is it, and where are the solutions?
Well, of course, rare diseases impact people, millions of people here in the US and around the world. And because they're rare diseases, frequently they don't impact a lot of people. And so it's very difficult to find cures for those diseases. 21st Century Cures that Congressman Fred Upton and I passed in 2016 and was signed into law by President Obama had some provisions to really help us make an impact on finding treatments and cures for rare diseases. And now we're working more to find those cures for faster, even for more people who have rare diseases.
And finding cures where, in terms of the role of NIH, in terms of university hospitals, where is the research being done? And what are some of the big questions that you think need to be answered?
Well, there's research being done at the NIH and also in universities around the country and around the world. But we need to help researchers get access to data better. And that's something that Fred's and my new legislation really focuses in on, how we can utilize and get researchers access to data while still protecting privacy for the patients, obviously. But also, one of the provisions in the law that we have is an ability to expand genetic testing, particularly for pediatric patients, because they have had very, very long and involved difficulty getting the information they need to begin to identify these diseases and then to find treatments and cures. So basically, speeding up access to data and then the ability to get the information researchers need to develop treatments.
As you know, Representative, people are living longer. That is the good news, but it's also creating a number of challenges in the healthcare field, especially when it comes to rare diseases or diseases that affect the elderly predominantly, such as Alzheimer's.
Yes, we have a number of tough nuts to crack that we're seeing an alarming increase. Alzheimer's is one, Parkinson's, other brain diseases, rare brain diseases. And in our 21st Century Cures bill, Fred Upton and I put several $1 billion into that type of research, but we still haven't been able to cure it. And so President Biden has really come up with an innovative new idea, ARPA-H, which is modeled on the DARPA model in the Defense Department, where you would put together a team of sort of a lean, mean research machine to take a problem like Alzheimer's, to collect researchers from every sector, and then to put them together to try to find cures for that disease. And Fred Upton and Anna Eshu, the chair of the health subcommittee, and I are working quite closely on language to authorize ARPA-H. We've already got some funding for it in the appropriations bills, but we really think if we could model a very streamlined process, we could make some real progress in these difficult diseases, including, by the way, cancers.
As you know, for anyone who has gone through the process of determining what the illness is, the term diagnostic odyssey, before they finally figure out what is causing that rare illness, that rare disease. Is there anything that can be done to shorten that process? Because any family member, any patient who has gone through that knows how difficult and painful it really can be.
Well, in our new bill, Cures 2.0, Fred and I have several innovations at the Food and Drug Administration that we think will enable people to have much faster diagnoses, and also will help caregivers communicate much better with patients, particularly in vulnerable communities and communities of color. In addition, I have another bill I'm working on with Congressman Larry Bouchon called the VALID Act, and this is a bill that will give us the opportunity, really for the first time, to regulate laboratory-based testing. We've got bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate for both of these, all of these bills, ARPA-H, Cures 2.0, and the VALID Act.
And so with all three of these, Congresswoman, what is the structure of that in terms of Washington, NIH, the research component, the federal government? Who responds to who? How would all of that work?
Well, so with the VALID Act, this would give the FDA the ability to regulate lab-based tests, just like it does medical devices and drugs and things like that. With Cures 2.0, it's really some revisions within a number of the federal agencies, NIH, but in particular, the FDA and CMS, to try to get funding for new drugs and devices more quickly so that we can get those cures into the hands of the patients. And then with ARPA-H will be a new agency. The Biden administration hopes that it will be housed within the NIH, but it'll be independent from the NIH. And it will be, as I said, a lean, mean research machine.
There's also been some criticism, to be fair, about the approval process when it comes to drugs in the FDA. Does this in any way speed up the process? What do you think could be done to streamline it and make it more efficient and more timely?
Well, my opinion is that we need to have the ability to have drugs reviewed and approved in a timely fashion. But we also need to make sure that the safety and efficacy is there, obviously, for the patients. And so one thing I really think is important, and I've pushed for many years, is post-market review, which is what we've seen with that new Alzheimer's drug that was recently approved by the FDA and others. It's kind of a balance sometimes between making sure that we get new drugs and devices out, particularly for diseases for which we don't have a treatment or cure, but we also want to make sure that they're safe for the patient and that they work. So having that review process is important. Having robust funding at the FDA is important, and also having the FDA and CMS working together. So once a drug or a device is approved, that it can get funded for the patients. That's also critical.
Congresswoman, one of the success stories, and many people point to Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, working together on Operation Warp Speed, put in place by the previous administration to make sure that we had a vaccine in place for COVID-19. Are there lessons that can be applied to what you're talking about when you have a public-private partnership, NIH, the FDA, universities, and the federal government working for a common goal?
Yes, and in fact, Fred and I are very proud because we believe that some of the provisions of 21st Century Cures gave the FDA the authority to put the the process of Operation Warp Speed in place, and then to use the emergency use approval process to get those vaccines reviewed and approved as quickly as possible. Now, I do want to stress, we always have to make sure that we're not cutting corners on approval, because we want to make sure that the drugs work and that they're safe. But if you have a situation like this, where you're able to bring together teams from the agency itself, from the NIH and the FDA, but also from the pharmaceutical companies and the research universities, to structure clinical tests, to then be able to conduct those clinical tests on a widespread basis, and then to be able to approve on an emergency use basis, then that's why we were able to get these vaccines as quickly as we could. And by the way, in Cures 2.0, Fred and I also have a whole section that will help us target some of the most vulnerable populations for those clinical trials. Because one thing we learned during the COVID clinical trials is it's a lot harder to get those populations, communities of color and low income populations, enrolled in those studies, but yet it's critical to see if those therapies are going to work.
And you have been so involved in this issue during your time in Congress. What are the questions that you have that need to be answered? What concerns you the most moving forward on these pieces of legislation?
Well, I what concerns me, I want to make sure that as we figure out how to structure our health research system to respond to so many exciting developments, the mapping of the human genome, the ability to use telemedicine and biometrics and all of that, I want to make sure that we continue to keep the patient at the heart of all of that. So while we're having more and more esoteric and effective treatments, we need to make sure that those treatments really do work for the patients, that the patients understand that, but also critically that they can afford those treatments. Some of the new treatments involve such complex research that once they get to the bedside, they may be very, very expensive. And I think this is something that Congress is really going to have to grapple with as we go forward.
And finally, you literally wrote the House bill when it came to stem cell research. What more can we learn from that?
So way back when we passed the stem cell research bill, and then when President Obama enshrined that into an executive order, it was a bill to allow ethical embryonic stem cell research. And after that happened, and there was a lot of exciting research going on, particularly in the area of diabetes. But after that happened, it sort of faded into the background, and everybody said, oh, well, that's been superseded. We don't need that anymore. And then just a few months ago, Doug Melton at Harvard announced that he had actually finally been able to make cells, islet cells, that produce insulin from embryonic stem cells after all these years. And he thinks that this will cure type 1 diabetes. They're still working on, they've been approved for phase 1 trials, but they're still working on the final approval. But if this happens, it will be a cure for diabetes. So the lesson that teaches me is that policymakers need to give researchers the tools that they need to find cures and the methods that they need to find cures, the funding that we need to do the research, and then we need to step back. We shouldn't be micromanaging, for example, what types of cells researchers use, as long as they're used in an ethical way. We need to trust the scientists, and we need to work hand in hand, realizing we're just policymakers, and the scientists are really the ones finding these cures.
But engaging the tone of your voice, it seems as if you're excited about some potential breakthroughs because of all of this.
Well, let me just say, from a personal basis, my daughter Francesca is a type 1 diabetic who was diagnosed when she was age 4 in 1999, right about the time this whole issue started. That's how I got involved in in biomedical research issues to begin with. And so if you have a family member, to go back to what you were saying, if you have a family member with a disease that could actually be cured by research, that makes you personally excited to see this happen.
Diana DeGette represents Colorado's 1st Congressional District. She is joining us from Denver. We appreciate your time and expertise on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. Great being with you again.
And again, we want to thank the representative providing her perspective, Diana DeGette, Democrat of Colorado. And that brings us an end to our program. A big thank you to Alexion Pharmaceuticals for its support, and to all of you for attendees who had the chance to join us for this discussion. If you missed any of the conversations, we will have the video from this event up on our website shortly. I'm Steve Scully. Have a great weekend.